Hello, recording. All right, so last week we kind of did another whirlwind tour. And we've been kind of sort of rushing, but I've been trying to let you guys, rather than stop and slow down, and you got the notes, right? So you guys can kind of go back through this. But I want you to see these themes start developing through the books and how they're picked back up. Okay, and how they rely on one another, and how, something like the presence of God, right? The losing of the presence of God, remember in the garden? Why is it so significant when you start getting to Exodus, right? That the presence of God is now dwelling with man. Wait a minute. I thought we lost that privilege, right? And yet God is wanting to and desiring to have His presence with us. And that presence, wherever it is in a location, right, becomes holy ground, and things start happening around the presence of God that don't happen outside of the presence of God. And then you have places where God has deemed where He's put a covenant over somebody, over something, and it all of a sudden becomes sacred and holy, even if God's smoke, right, or if the cloud isn't there. Like, remember we talked about Rahab's house became a little bit of a holy box that if you are inside of, there is salvation found in these places. And these themes get picked up and developed and regurgitated, and I believe they grow. They become more than what they are at the beginning, but they're relying upon the foundation of the first 5 books. Everything, in my opinion, is always coming back to something here. And I don't mean every verse, but major stories, there is some kind of reference back to here because this has established something. Okay, this has established something. Let's go to 1 Samuel because we sort of got into Samuel last week, and I made a mistake last week, and Don caught it. I had said that God was not speaking to them all the way back to the time of Joshua. It just says, visions were rare. God was rarely speaking to them. Okay? But interestingly enough, when you read Exodus, God is talking to Moses at every single stop, at every single point, right? Everywhere they go, God's coming down and say, hey, let's have a conversation, right? And so there's conversations going on and on and on, even with Joshua. And yet, throughout the book of Judges, you see it kind of dwindling to the point where Samuel begins with a barren womb. What should be triggered in your head when you see a barren womb in the Bible? Well, Sarah, right? You go back to Sarah. You go back to Rebecca. Right? And God makes covenants, right, through these barren wombs. But even go back, why can they expect? Why can Hannah go on behalf of God and expect God to make her womb fruitful? The promise. The promise was that your seed, you would be fruitful and multiply. Remember when we get to the book of Exodus? They are so large. God has blessed their seed so much that they are growing. Well, as you get further away from that ideal, the book of Leviticus, when they were doing it right, day 1, the further you get away of day 1, after Moses enters in the tent of meeting in the book of Numbers, the conversations with God become less and less and less, and you start seeing blessings that they once enjoyed start going away. So when you read and you open up and you read something like, well, there's a barren womb, you've got to start realizing something is wrong. Something is wrong. Because you go back to the blessing that God says your womb will not be barren. You're right? Your seed will multiply. Okay? And then, here's an interesting thing. The tabernacle, right, is at Shiloh. And so she goes to the tabernacle to pray. Now, when you go back into like the book of Leviticus and Numbers and you're reading on how they should pray, one of the ways they should pray is basically a crying out, a wailing out. And when Eli sees Hannah praying, what does he think she's doing? The fact that he doesn't recognize a proper prayer that is actually established back in the book of Leviticus shows you what? Was that kind of prayer happening? Well, as you keep going into the story, what are you start suspecting of why proper things probably aren't going on at the temple, the tabernacle? What are Eli? His sons. Especially if you're a woman coming to the tabernacle, what was happening at the tabernacle? Women were getting taken advantage of. So that's going on, and yet Hannah doesn't care about any of that. She wants a child. And so she goes. Okay? And one of the cool things is, what does she tell the Lord she will do with her child if he blesses her with a child? I will lend him, in a sense. I will give him back. He will be my first fruit offering. What does she have? She's married. She's got all this stuff that her husband loves her, right? More than his other wife. But because she's barren, he's had to take another wife to produce offspring because there's something wrong with her. And so she's barren, he's blessing her with stuff, and she goes, my first fruit offering is not the stuff my husband's giving me, it will be my child. And so she sees this as a gift from God. These were pity gifts that she was given, but that's not what she desires. And so you start seeing, this is where you start seeing that idea of that faithful remnant. And a lot of times they're odd characters, right? They're characters you wouldn't expect. Shouldn't it be the husband who's leading his family, right? Especially under the patriarch system, the husband's responsibility is to be leading his wife. And why isn't he there praying with her? Why isn't he praying for this? Why does he have two wives, right? You start asking all these questions. There's something going on that is wrong, okay? And you start suspecting at the end of the book of Judges, what is the final verse in the book of Judges? There is no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in their own eyes. Why would they be blessed? Right? Why would they be blessed? And that takes you back to Deuteronomy. One of the specific promises that God made of the blessing and cursing was that if you are faithful to the covenant and you serve God with all of your heart, one of the blessings is childbearing. One of the curses of not following was that there would be barrenness. You find this theme back in Deuteronomy, and you're watching it play out. And this is a theme that continues over and over and over again. And ultimately, when you get to like Isaiah chapter 7, remember when the king comes to Isaiah and he says, hey, when will our enemies, right, be defeated? What does Isaiah point out? When this child, or when this woman, who is a virgin, gives birth, you will name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. And when he is at the proper age, then you will know that I am rescuing. So he works the blessing and curse idea into their idea of rescuing. And by the way, Deuteronomy, right after that verse of the blessing and cursing, is you will reject me, you will go into exile, but if you repent, I can again bless you. So there's this constant theme. You know, a lot of people only go to the book of Judges because it's much more apparent in that book, but it is the overarching theme. The same thing happens over and over and over again, okay? So now we started in the book of Samuel, And we're here, and this is where we start uniting the kingdom of Israel. Okay? All 12 tribes have gotten their land, right? When you have the Mediterranean, here's going to be my wonderful drawing. Okay? You've got the Mediterranean, you got the Dead Sea over here, you got Babylon over here, Assyria up here. This is where like Italy would be. This is the fertile land, okay? And so the promised land is actually right about there, okay? Somewhere in that. But all the tribes, here's, some of them have double portions, right? I can't say that without thinking of Jacob Evans. If you know, you know. Right? So they're all fractured, okay? They're all fractured. And Jerusalem, by the way, is right about here. And Shiloh, where this is happening, is actually north of there, okay? And this actually becomes the location later on where Israel, remember when Israel and Judah split, the 10 northern tribes split? Shiloh gets renamed, but this becomes the home of Samaria. Remember when Jesus is wanting to travel through Samaria? Well, there's a river right here. Okay, and what they would do is they would cross the river to go around Samaria, right? And Jesus wanted to go through it. Okay? And so this becomes, I don't know what that is now, but this becomes the location. So they're all divided. And yet God says, I'm going to make you my people. You will be my nation. And so Samuel is about the uniting of God's people together. Now, remember, end of Judges, every man did what was right in his own eyes. The end of Joshua, Joshua's saying, hey, you guys are starting to get real friendly with these foreign idols. Choose you this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Do not serve idols. Well, they really liked the idol worship because a lot of the idols were like, hey, if you serve this God, you know, you'll get lots of rain. You serve this God, your crops will grow. So they were trying to pick and choose gods that would help them. And when gods wouldn't help them, they would ban them for another one. And God's going, have I not fed you? Remember when you wandered through the wilderness and food fell from heaven? And you watched that? Remember when Moses struck a rock and water came out of a rock? And you drank, and interestingly enough, you know, you're looking at probably 2 million people in the wilderness. They all drank from a rock. How much water was coming out of that rock? All right? How much food was falling down? Now, how often did the food fall down from heaven? Once a week, right? Because every Sabbath, they were not allowed to even work, and God says, I will provide. So for 40 years, they provided bread and water, plus the defeating of all of their enemies. All right? So, Samuel, we are going to unite the nation. But they want a king after the nations. Samuel warns them, this is not the kind of king you want, right? And God tells them, hey, tell them these are the things that are going to happen if they want this kind of king. Samuel tells them, this is what this king's going to do. What do the people do? We still want that king. Send him to us. Right? He's a head taller than everybody. He looks very king-like. And God even, what does God give Saul to make him king? To prove that he's king. What does he give him? It's another theme. That when God is with somebody, God sends his spirit. And the first time that God sends his spirit is, remember Jabesh Gilead? They were under threat. They were a tribe. They weren't united yet. And the Philistines were surrounding them. And what did they tell them they were going to do if they didn't surrender to the Philistines? Pluck out their eye, right? The one right eye, or cut off one of the hands. It was one of those. And when Saul found out, it's the first time it says he was filled with the Spirit of the Lord, and the Lord came upon him. And what did he do? He united all the troops. He cut up an animal, 12 pieces, sent them out, and said, if you don't come to the aid of your brother, if we don't come as a united front, because at this time they're still, like the book of Judges is all them worried about themselves. It's all happening to individual tribes and individual families. It's not happening to the nation altogether. And so he says, if we don't come together, and they came together, and Saul was anointed king. Well, how well does that work out for Saul? He then becomes his own kind of king. And when God asks him to destroy all the Amalekites, he keeps what? And you remember what he keeps? He says, kill all the people, kill all the flock, kill all the animals, don't leave anything. Because a lot of their animals, by the way, were unclean animals anyway. The ones that they ate. Someone said, Justin, do you say what he...
Some sheep and...
He kept 20,000 different animals. And he also kept the king alive. Because he wanted to parade the king. Now, this is what he told God later. I wanted to kill him in front of. And then when Samuel actually confronts him again, who does he blame for all of his actions? The people. They made me do it. Wait a minute. Who just sent out an animal, cut an animal in 12, sent them out to all the nations, said, if you don't come and help, I will cut you up like I cut this animal up. And you're telling me now, a fight later, that you've been pushed over by the people, and they forced you into this? No. And so, what does God remove from him? God removes his spirit. And when he removes his spirit, what happens to Saul?
Becomes timid and weak.
Timid, weak, jealous. He starts going a little nutty. At night, he can't sleep. It says that he's been given basically a devil spirit, a evil spirit. It's literally just a malevolent spirit. Funny thing is when you actually read the story, God only sends it to him during times when he lacks faith. When you read it, when you read the story, it is times when David's at his table, and he throws a spear at him, and all of a sudden what happens to Saul? His spirit starts acting up. When the Philistines come, and rather than driving them out, he lets some of them stay and doesn't kill them all of a sudden, because he's not fulfilling the will of God, he gets this evil spirit. And David would come, who has the Spirit of God, who is a man after God's own heart, would play an instrument, and the spirit would go away. And so David then becomes a representative of somebody who has the Spirit of God, and he's able, where David goes, there are the pockets of God's presence that go with him. Oh, you have a malevolent spirit, an evil spirit in you? Put David in the room. That spirit's not going to stay long. Why? Because he's got the Spirit of God. It's not that just David was really good on the harp, okay? It's because he has the Spirit of the Lord. And David proves himself to be a child of God. And so we know what happens, right? Saul spends his entire life doing what? The rest of his life, what does he spend doing? Chasing David, trying to kill him. When he could have been, David was an ally. How many times did David have to tell him, I'm not your enemy. I'm not your enemy. I'm not trying to usurp your throne. He had a good opportunity when Saul was relieving himself in a cave. Your pants down, swords down, shields down. David's got a sword. Could have easily taken care of him and decided not to. If he needed a sign, should have used that sign. Well, it happens again, remember? Saul is sleeping, and he takes Saul's spear, and he takes the spear of the captain of his army. I could have killed you again. He even taunts the captain of his army. I thought you were supposed to be the one protecting the Lord's anointed. David proved himself to be a child of God. And the book of 1 Samuel ends with Saul dying, Jonathan dying. We start up in 2 Samuel, and David becomes king. But what happens to David as he becomes king? He starts doing all the things that he needs to be doing. And then he rises up. They start feeling some peace because the enemies, as God told him, right? The enemies, because God told them that they're starting to die out and to flee. David starts feeling comfortable. So instead of leading the battles like he had, and remember David, who's got the Spirit of the Lord in him? David was what they thought the Ark of the Covenant could have been for them. David stays at home and says, I don't need to be a part when the armies and kings were supposed to be off to war, it says. 2 Samuel 13. David stays home. That's showing you that there's something wrong. David has become less of who he was. And one of the things is when you go to Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy 17, there's this entire clause about what a king is supposed to do. Interesting, they don't have a king yet. So some people speculate, was this added later? Or did Moses prophesy? I think Moses probably foresaw it. God foresaw it. But what was one of the things the king was supposed to do? Anyone know? They were supposed to yearly
keep the people faithful to God.
Well, keep the people faithful to God. They were to take the law every year and reread it, not just reread it, have it rewritten. They were supposed to write it out. And he says, if you do that, you will remember, because as you read the story, you need to remember every victory is won because of whom? Because of God and not us. Somewhere along the line, David is losing that. So we don't have evidence that he didn't rewrite the law, but what you see in his life is he wasn't following something. He wasn't following something that led him to a position where he saw Bathsheba bathing, by the way. Never says she was on a roof, okay? That's a song, but the text doesn't say she was bathing on a roof. But, they've got windows. They don't have what we have, curtains, all that stuff. But, he's looking down, being in a place where he ought not at bath time, seeing her. And once again, is seeing a naked woman anything wrong with that? If you accidentally see a naked woman? All right, you can't help that. If she walks through the room, why are you here, right? But if I pursue that, all right, so not good, okay? So what we learn in Samuel, let's go to 2 Samuel. Let's look at the very end of 2 Samuel 24. And so after David sins, he takes Bathsheba. He has a child with her. Child dies, right? Child dies. Interesting. When you see a child dying, who's come from God's anointed and someone else, something happened. What was one of the curses? What's one of the curses in Deuteronomy? You're not going to be fruitful. And so what does God do? Takes from them of their first child. Go all the way back to 1 Samuel. All the way back to the beginning of Samuel. Hannah, who can't have a child, prays to God and shows faith and is granted a child. David, who loses faith, who has a child, loses it. If you're not, while you're reading, these are things you need to keep in mind. Things that have already happened, themes that have been going on in previous, right? And you need to be following these patterns through, because we go, well, why would God kill a child? Well, we have precedent for that. We have precedent for that. Because we know from the story of even Abraham, that God can ask you to kill your own child. And we need to have the faith. What? That even if he dies, right, like Isaac, God can raise him from the dead, or God will provide a substitute or a sacrifice. David's lack of faith, he wasn't trusting, right? He was relying on himself. He was then trying to cover it up. Right? What does he do with Uriah? Well, what does he do before that? Well, how does he try to cover it up? Uriah, go home to your wife tonight. There's no way, King, I can go home. My comrades are out fighting, and it would be dishonorable of me. Of course, he had to find the wife with an honorable husband, right? Right? It would be dishonorable for me to go sleep with my wife while my brothers in arms are out fighting a war that really, King, you ought to be out there with us. I will not go home. And he slept on David's doorpost, right? Would not even go home to be tempted to be with his wife. And you're seeing an honor, shame, right? And that's a huge thing in this culture. And God honors Uriah. Now, what does David do with Uriah? Kills him. And it's the only time Kings tells us, in 1 Kings chapter 5, it is the only time it says David departed from the Lord. But what happens if you depart from the Lord once? What does that make David as our ideal king? He no longer qualifies. Okay? Because we're waiting for this prophet like Moses, this person who would lead God's people, and at times, David acts as a prophet. He also acts as a priest, and God is okay with it. There are times David puts on the ephod. He puts on the priestly cloak, and he asks God, what should we do? And people go, well, how could David do that? Well, they've been waiting for a prophet king who could take on the priestly attributes, right? And maybe David's the Messiah. Not anymore. Right? And so he lost. And so at the end of 2 Samuel, how does the book of Samuel end? It ends with David taking a census. What is the problem with a census? God didn't ask him to do it. And God told David over and over and over again, do not count your people, trust me. Because David was counting it for battle. He was counting his military might and strength. Has God ever relied upon military strength to win a war, to win a battle? Chronicles actually tells us that it was Satan who entered into David and was the one who was the influence behind David censoring. Now it ends, look at the end. Look at verse 25. This is how the book of Samuel ends. But David built there an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord responded to the plea for the land, and the plague was averted from Israel. End. David has to end with a sacrifice for a sin that he's committed, and God told them, I can lift the curse. And there's, in the book of Leviticus, there are appropriate, sacrifices and offerings that you can get to relieve these curses. That is why when you get into the prophets, and we're going to get there here in a little bit, when you get to Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, they plea, turn to the Lord, offer the correct offering, and God will remove your enemies. It's easy. It's been done. Yes, you've made this mistake, and here's where you are. Just repent. You've got precedent for it. It's happened over and over and over again. Just trust him. And what would they not do? You know what they would do? Okay, we'll offer the offering, but we're going to keep living and trusting in ourselves and keep living a sinful life. Can you just give an offering without giving an offering of your life? Right? When you go back to Deuteronomy, it is to do these things with all of your heart. You can't give an offering to God with all of your heart in repentance, knowing you're going to keep being the same slime ball, right, that you were previous, and think, well, the animal will take on all my sin, and technically it would, if you gave it with all of your heart. As David does, God removes the plague, and it ends. Okay? So, we're seeing God uniting the people. So, David is king for about 40 years. Okay, so they're united for about 40 years. And then the book of 1 Kings is all about David. The beginning of 1 Kings is David handing over his throne to Solomon. Who was Solomon's mother? Bathsheba. So they go and continue to have more kids. Now, David had other wives, right? His first wife was who? Michal, or however you pronounce it. Saul's daughter. Remember, Saul gives David his daughter for winning, bringing the heads, the foreskins of the head skins. What is that? Scalps. All right, let's just do that. All right, 100 of them. Foreskin. There's a lot in my head right now, okay? Try to get it all going. So, So, Solomon is the product of David's major sin. The only time he departed from the Lord, and Solomon is a product of that. Now, have we seen that pattern before? Have we seen the product of an unideal marriage or an unideal prospect of someone being entered into, by the way, the lineage of Christ, and be the way and the people whom God uses to redeem his people? You go all the way back to the story of Tamar. Remember Judah and Tamar? So Tamar marries Judah's son. Judah's son dies. And the principle of kinsman redeemer, found in the book of Leviticus, the next brother in line should have done what? Should have married Tamar. And he won't give, son dies. He won't give, son dies. Judah won't give Tamar, son dies. And so Judah is losing sons left and right because he won't keep a principle, because that's one of the curses. Your seed will not continue if you do not obey me from the heart. And so he keeps putting it off and putting it off. And finally, what does Tamar have to do? Dress up like a prostitute, basically. Steal his ring, sleep with him, come to him later, shame him in front of others. And Judah has to admit that Tamar was more righteous than Judah was. And anyone know where Tamar's from? She's a Canaanite. Should Judah's son been marrying a Canaanite anyway? No. But once you're in bed, right? Once you've already been entangled, it's the same thing. Remember when the Canaanites come to Joshua and they disguise themselves? Joshua makes a covenant with them. And when they appear to be Canaanites, wait a minute, we're supposed to be killing all of you. God goes, well, now you've made a covenant. And once you make a covenant, I don't care what my other laws have said, you would better honor that covenant. Okay? That's why I'm not a fan. Well, let's not get into that. That will be another discussion for another day. All right. Back. Where were we? Where were we? David, Bathsheba. All right. Bathsheba, Solomon. Solomon is the product of David's big sin. And yet God uses that line to redeem Israel. What you're supposed to be seeing is there is an ideal that God has established. Can God work through and with someone who cannot live up to the ideal as long as they're willing to serve him and repent and to give the proper offerings and the proper sacrifices when they sin, and as long as they serve him with all of their heart? The problem comes in is when we think we can just give offerings and sacrifices and keep living the way we want to live. So Kings is, remember in the book of 2 Samuel, what does God offer God, or what does David offer God? What does he say, I will do for you? And God does not let him. I'm going to build you a house, temple, right? And why does God tell David he can't do it? He's a man of blood. Do you know where Kings calls him a man of blood? Where the blood is on his hands? Wars that God told him to fight, that blood is on whose hands? It's on God's hands. All right? The Lord has used other people who have been warriors before. What blood do you think he's probably talking about that's on his hands? The blood of Uriah. Right? It's the same thing. You go back to Genesis. What does God tell Cain? The blood of Abel calls out to me. And so you're seeing this theme. Well, what blood? Is he just a man of bloodshed? I don't believe that. The theme is there is a blood that he spilled that he was not supposed to spill. And he sent him off to war to die. And blood is on his hands. Okay? So, Kings, he can't build it. Well, he'll make all the plans for it. He'll design it. Right? He does everything for it, hands it over to Solomon. And what you see with Solomon, is that the first bell or second bell? First? Okay. What you see with Solomon is remember right after the temple is finished, Solomon has a prayer. What does he ask for? Wisdom. And it's granted to him. So here's Solomon. Solomon is son of David. So for Messiah, check 1, right? 2 Samuel 7. Your son. He will build a kingdom. He will build my house. It will never be destroyed. 2. Built a temple. He built the house of the Lord. Check 2. He's looking pretty good for our Messiah figure. The Messiah was also supposed to be, and you learn this Isaiah, but you also go back to Deuteronomy, he was supposed to have wisdom. Right? Go read Deuteronomy. I'll figure it out and I'll send it to you later. He's supposed to have wisdom in Isaiah. By the way, that's the whole point of Isaiah chapter. I think it's either 9 or 11. That says this. It's 11, where the Spirit of the Lord would be upon him, and he would be full of wisdom. And there's 7 things that he would have: knowledge, wisdom, courage, faith. So he has wisdom, and he's the most wise person in all the earth. He's looking good to be our Messiah who would save Israel. What ends up with Solomon? What does he marry? Everybody? Yeah. Wait, the better question is, who didn't he marry? Right? Because when you're thinking over 700 wives, you know, you've probably got your lineage out in every land. You know, we might all be a son of Solomon somewhere. if he procreated, right, with all of his wives. But he fails. And then the book of Kings ends dramatically, one king after another. That's why you just go boom. It almost, to us, doesn't make sense going back from north to south, 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 north, south, north. What do you learn? What are the 2 things it said about the king? They either were like their father, who, by the way, goes all the way back to Solomon, or they were like David. And in the south, there were 7 or 9, because some of them were partial, right, depending on which part of their life. And it ends, the book of Kings, this is a really cool thing, by the way. Kings is the end of part 2. So part 1 was Torah, part 2 was prophets. Kings ends with Babylon has come and taken them into exile. Deuteronomy prophesied it. This will be your history. And it was, the north went into exile, boom, destroyed. South goes into exile, but there's a story that it ends with, and it just ends with Jeconiah, who's the last king. He's the last king. Nebuchadnezzar sets him free and does what? Watch this. So, evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that, by the way, this is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiakim of Judah from prison. He spoke kindly to him, who gave him a seat above the seats of the kings. Now look at this. And every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table, and for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king according to his daily needs as long as he lived. You see hope. You see hope. Even at the time of most despair, you're seeing hope. Part 3 we'll look at as we next week. There's Kings. You're seeing the story develop. What? No, I won't be here next week. Okay, I'll be in Jasper, Tennessee, preaching a gospel meeting. So 2 weeks. I know you're all on your edge of your seat.